If I wanted to be dramatic, I would say that 1983 is the year the world should have ended. Instead, I will say that if popular culture is a way for society to snitch on itself, then 1983 was a call for help. Because we start the year with... Then a 10-year-old writes a letter to the leader of the Soviet Union, who then promises to never use nukes first. And then the commander of the Soviet 4th Army Air Forces in Europe orders his units to make preparations for the immediate use of nuclear weapons. That is one of the most insane sentences I have ever written. And it doesn't include the part where Stanislav Petrov decided that the United States wasn't actually retaliating against the Soviet Union for shooting down a plane that had an American congressman on it. Yes, that all happened in the same year, and I still left out the release of War Games. And the year still wasn't done, because speaking of movies being released, I still haven't mentioned that this was the same year that one of the most watched movies in television history premieres. A movie about NATO and the Warsaw Pact launching nukes at each other. I originally was going to make this video just about Samantha Smith, because her story is a perfect encapsulation of the Cold War. But I quickly realized that it's just one small part of the full story that is 1983, the scariest year in history. The story of 1983 naturally kicks off in 1982. You see, over the course of the 1970s, the United States and the Soviet Union engaged in a policy known as détente. The idea was that nothing constructive could be gained by the world constantly living in a state of tension on the verge of war, with the United States and the Soviet Union constantly at each other's throats. So over the decade, the two superpowers agreed to play nice with each other and made steps towards coexistence with the idea that the Cold War was just the way things were going to be. This is the decade Nixon goes to Moscow, Brezhnev comes to Camp David, and astronauts and cosmonauts shook hands while orbiting the Earth. Now there is plenty of evidence that this era of lessened tensions didn't actually exist. Look at everything that was happening in the global south during the 1970s, for instance. But generally speaking, it was a good slogan and was what people actually wanted to believe was happening. The problem is, at the same time this is happening, the United States and the Soviet Union are entering into periods of economic stagnation and high inflation. Stagflation, which unfortunately isn't a deer-shaped balloon. This gives rise to the hardliners and the conservative movements of each country, who both believe the same thing. Détente was a lie, and we need people willing to actually fight the Cold War. The Soviet Union ends the idea of détente by invading Afghanistan in 1979. The United States elects Ronald Reagan in 1980, who repudiates détente shortly after taking office in 1981. And then, as Reagan begins escalating his rhetoric against the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov succeeds Brezhnev as the leader of the Soviet Union on 12 November 1982. Andropov had, just previous to this, been the head of the KGB, and he was seen by the West as having a very bloody past. It is with this backdrop that Andropov graces the cover of Time magazine on November 22, 1982, a magazine seen by a 10-year-old American girl, Samantha Smith. Samantha Smith had a question. I asked my mother who would start a war and why. She showed me a news magazine with a story about America and Russia, one that had a picture of the new Russian leader, Yuri Andropov, on the cover. We read it together. It seemed that the people in both Russia and America were worried that the other country would start a nuclear war. It all seemed so dumb to me. I had learned about the awful things that happened during World War II, so I thought that nobody would ever want to have another war. I told Mom that she should write to Mr. Andropov to find out who was causing all the trouble. She said, "Why don't you write to him?" So I did. Samantha's letter was as blunt as any letter from a 10-year-old could be. Are you going to vote to have a war or not? Why do you want to conquer the world, or at least our country? P.S. Please write back. As Samantha would say, she didn't expect a response. About a month later in West Berlin, December 28th to be exact, Nina performs a song about accidentally triggering the end of the world. When Ronald Reagan was elected president, the conservative movement in the United States expected him to use tough rhetoric on the Soviet Union. They got their wish. On March 8, 1983, Reagan gave what is known as the Evil Empire speech, which cast the Cold War as a fight between good and evil. Later that month, on March 23rd, Reagan unveiled the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. Its stated goal is eliminating the threat of intercontinental ballistic missiles, but it is criticized for circumventing the current mad state of affairs, and it sparks worries of a renewed and dangerous arms race. Then on April 18th, the United States Embassy in Beirut is bombed, killing 63. And then on April 26, 1983, a letter arrived in the mail from the Soviet Union for Samantha. It had been written on April 19th. It was from Yuri Andropov, the leader of the Soviet Union. In his response, Andropov doesn't shy away from the question, praises Smith forswears ever wanting war, states that the Soviet Union had no intention of ever using these weapons first against any nation, and then invites her to the Soviet Union to learn about those things firsthand. The trip in July of 1983 was wildly successful and turned Samantha into a celebrity that was referenced on the Golden Girls. If we end the story here, it is a story about peace and goodwill. But 1 month before that trip on June 3rd, War Games, a movie about accidentally triggering World War III, is released. And there's a line in Andropov's letter that we need to closely examine in light of that, particularly about the Soviet Union pledging to never use nukes first. The Soviet Union had in 1982 renounced first use of atomic weapons. But one of the things Andropov did while leader of the KGB was start what is known as Operation Ryan. With the end of détente, Andropov had initiated a new priority within the KGB, detecting and preempting a NATO nuclear first strike. This begins on March 25, 1981. Andropov announced that there was now a need for the KGB to work to prevent a Western nuclear first strike, with a new intelligence initiative to not miss the military preparations of the enemy, its preparations for a nuclear strike, and not to miss the real risk of the outbreak of war. There was no evidence that NATO was actively preparing for a strike, just the feeling that they should be. Ryan, standing for
Ракетно-ядерное нападение.
Nuclear missile attack, was the Soviet human intelligence effort. And the way that you preempt a first strike is, well, striking first. On July 11, 1981, Andropov would tell the head of East Germany's Ministry for State Security, the Stasi, the US is preparing for war, but it is not willing to start a war. They are not building factories and palaces in order to destroy them. They are striving for military superiority in order to check us, and then declare checkmate against us without starting a war. As the early 1980s rolled on, this effort became more refined, as the KGB roped in other allied intelligence agencies, such as units in Bulgaria and East Germany's Stasi. I can't overstate how obsessed the Soviet Union became with finding any evidence that the United States and NATO was about to launch this first strike. What Andropov had effectively created was a solution in search of a problem, and much like when you have a hammer, all you see is nails. Andropov communicated on January 11, 1983, that he was fearful of war being caused by miscommunication and accident. And then the next day, the new head of the KGB stated, due to American rhetoric, it was time to become more decisive and go on the offensive. And as we have been covering, 1983 was going to hand them every nail necessary. On September 1st, 1983, the Soviet Union shot down a plane with 62 Americans and an American congressman on it. The Soviet Union would, in fact, initially say that this incident had been manufactured specifically so the United States could respond in kind. Then on September 26, unknown to the public, the 1983 Soviet nuclear false alarm incident occurs. This is where Soviet military officer Stanislav Petrov averts a worldwide nuclear war by correctly identifying a warning of attack by US missiles as a false alarm. As said by Petrov, the only thing that prevented him from passing the report on is this incredibly chilling thought. When people start a war, they don't start it with only 5 missiles. Petrov had made this determination against the backdrop that the Soviet military apparatus was fully expecting the United States to do exactly this. Then on October 23rd, simultaneous truck bombings destroyed both the French Army and United States Marine Corps barracks in Beirut, killing 241 US servicemen, 58 French paratroopers, and 6 Lebanese civilians. Then on October 25th, the United States invades Grenada. To say that things were tense in the world would be an understatement. The KGB had began the year thinking that the United States was itching for a war, and all the previous 2 months had done was lay that groundwork. And things were about to get worse, because on November 7th, NATO began the Able Archer exercises. It is unknown exactly how close Able Archer 83 was to provoking a Soviet preemptive first strike. But the more that is declassified and analyzed, the more we start to realize that we were much closer to it than previously thought. Next to the Cuban Missile Crisis, it is considered the closest the world ever came to nuclear war. As written by Fred Kaplan in 2021, most US officers viewed Able Archer as a typical war game, nothing that would throw Soviet officers into a panic. But as Kaplan continued, this year was a lot bigger than most of these games, involving a fleet of cargo transport planes flying 19,000 soldiers and 170 sorties from the United States to bases in Europe, and it was more realistic as well. The cargo planes maintained radio silence. B-52 bomber crews taxied their planes to their runways and loaded them with dummy bombs that looked remarkably real. The Strategic Air Command raised its alert levels to the highest level. The United States knew that the Soviet Union was monitoring all of this, but something was different this time. As Kaplan recounted, the Soviet commanders reacted in ways that they never had before, in ways similar to how they might have acted if the US were gearing up for a real attack, including, as we now know, loading nuclear bombs on aircraft in Eastern Europe. This was only known for certain later, as NSA signals intelligence wasn't available to NATO commanders in real time. Signals intelligence that stated that the commander of Soviet 4th Army Air Forces in Eastern Europe ordered his units to make preparations for the immediate use of nuclear weapons. NATO commanders, regardless, felt that something was off about this Soviet reaction. And according to one account, instead of increasing tit-for-tat real-world escalations, they held off. Able Archer ended, and neither did the world. About a week and a half after the conclusion of Able Archer on November 20th, the day after is watched on American television by 100 million people. It is a shockingly graphic movie about what is fast becoming a realistic scenario involving an exchange of nukes between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. This is still one of the most watched programs in American history. Historians have noted that after Reagan watched the film that his rhetoric on war and towards the Soviet Union became a lot less combative. The movie is a legitimate turning point in the Cold War. But the year still wasn't done, because on December 27th, Pope John Paul II forgave the man who tried to assassinate him. As the saying goes, we will take a cup of kindness yet for Auld Lang Syne. But after all of this, I would prefer some whiskey.